Hi, this is my first time doing this, so bear with me. We ended the Roman Republic with civil wars and the ascension of Augustus to the throne and the acceptance by the Senate of a single ruler, an autocrat. So I titled this Autocracy and Stability. Rome's going to be run by an emperor, and the Senate felt that it could avoid further civil wars by having a single ruler at its head. So let's look first at Augustus's changes to the government and his rule, and then we'll take on some of the rulers that followed him, because the succeeding emperors would be relatives of his. They would either be Julio or Claudian, so we call them the Julio-Claudian rulers, and they weren't necessarily the best people for rule, so it was a problematic method of appointing an emperor. But let's look at Augustus first, and in the period that's known as the Pax Romana. As we said, he's a sole ruler, and part of the reason for that is they hoped for stability. He was very good at one thing, and that was administration. So he will transform Rome. They say he took a city of bricks and made it a city of marble, and so a phrase that indicates all the building projects that Augustus engaged in. He also did some very practical things. The police force was created, so it was no longer just gangs protecting themselves and each other, but there were police on the streets to protect individual citizens. He created a fire force too. Rome had had a terrible problem with fires breaking out, so those were two things that really benefited the ordinary person. He made a show of sharing power with the Senate, and in restoring political order, he would have to deal with the military. And of course, the military had to be reformed. He reduced the number of legions, and he made sure that they were paid by the state rather than as previously being paid by the consul. He also created a private guard for the emperor called the Praetorian Guard. The Praetorian Guard would be an important addition to the military because it would become increasingly important in the choosing of the next emperor. The period of Augustus's rule is known as the Age of Augustus, and in that period we get advances. We get some literary greats. In fact, most of the Roman works that we know come from the period of Augustus, which is ironic. We do have Republican literature, of course, but the real greats in Roman literature are often, you'll see that a lot of them are written in the Age of Augustus. So a few things. Virgil wrote his Aeneid, which is a epic poem to rival Homer, and he takes Homer's plots. The first half of the Aeneid, the first 6 books, are about Aeneas's voyage from Troy, and his facing all sorts of troubles before he finally gets in the second 6 books to Rome, where he will fight to establish the city of Rome, and that's what the Aeneid is about. One of the big lessons in the Aeneid for young little Romans was the necessity of duty to Rome. Horace writes, and as we said, one of the only inventions in literature for the Romans, writes his satires. So we have a whole host of satires written in the period by Horace. Philosophy, too, is advanced, and we said before that the Romans took up Stoicism for the most part, and Seneca would become the Stoic philosopher of the age. Also, Rome built more aqueducts and sewage systems, and the city of Rome and the emperors and the leading elite understood they needed to get grain and gladiator shows, grain and entertainment, bread and entertainment, to the citizens of Rome. The whole period for 200 years, from Augustus's ascension all the way through the 2nd century AD, is known as the Pax Romana. Pax means peace, and so it means Roman peace. So it was a period of relative quiet in Rome. I could point out to you rebellions that they had to put down and things like that. But relatively, the people in the Mediterranean region were under a pretty peaceful time and a flourishing time in the sense of commerce. The first rulers in the first century are known, as I said, the Julio-Claudian emperors. And I just want to look at a few of them, because the question here is whether an emperor and an autocrat is the ideal type of ruler, and then how do you replace him? What happens when your emperor dies, and how is he succeeded? Is he by family? Should the Praetorian Guard choose them? And those are two ways that Rome did it following Augustus's ascension as emperor. So the Julio-Claudian emperors, and I'm going to emphasize the bad ones because this is a problematic, right? They were Julio-Claudian. Those were two families that were married together, and Julio, in fact, refers to Julius Caesar's family. One of the rulers in the Julio-Claudian line in the first century was Caligula. The word itself means little boots, and he was known for his eccentricities and cruelty. He killed many in his family, and he was himself brutal and perverse as far as we know. Much of the information that we get about these Julio-Claudian come from a work that was written by a Roman writer 100 years after, or just short, maybe 50 years after, Suetonius, and it's usually titled in English The 12 Emperors, and it's biographies. So we get these biographies from him, and this is where a lot of our information comes, not all. There are other writers in the period. But anyways, Caligula seems certainly to have been a brutal and perverse ruler. He was eventually assassinated, probably by senators, or at least the senators had him assassinated, and he was paranoid his whole time as emperor. Show you another type of emperor. The man who followed him was Claudius. Claudius doesn't become emperor until he's 51 years old, and he was not trained to be an emperor. To be an emperor, you needed to have a military career and to know how to administer the state. And Claudius had spent most of his time in his youth and in his adult life reading. He wanted to be a scholar. He wanted to write histories as Livy wrote histories. Now, in his defense, even though he was trained as a scholar, he did lead the military up to conquer the southern part of Britain. Another bad ruler, if I can say that, is Nero. And Nero is known for diplomacy and extravagance, right? He ultimately would commit suicide. Nero is the emperor who built a gigantic barge on one of the northern lakes in Italy just for fun, and he had parties on it, and as far as we know, the parties were quite wild. In fact, they excavated the lake and found the barge, so that's an interesting archaeological find. He also is said to have he wanted to be a gladiator, so he got himself out there in the gladiator rings to participate with these gladiators. Of course, it was all set up for him. He thought he was a great musician, and he would he would pay people to come in and listen to him perform and clap for him. So anyways, those were Nero's peculiarities. All right, so he would eventually commit suicide. And if Suetonius, who again writes about these guys, is correct, he had a hard time doing it himself, so his servant had to help him with his suicide. All right, in addition, the 2nd century of the Pax Romana, then we have the 5 good emperors. So the Julio-Claudian line didn't give us very many good emperors. They all seem to have had flaws, if Suetonius is correct. But the 2nd century AD had some very good emperors. So let's look at what the emperors, and they came from other families, and by this time the Praetorian Guard was choosing them. So these 5 good emperors, let's look at a few of them and what they did. Trajan was famous for invading Dacia and defeating the Dacians and taking over the region, which is in the Germanies, and it's north of the Danube River. Remember, we said that the Danube marked the natural boundary. Going north of it was pretty tough, just getting across the river. We have a column that was created to reveal the invasion of Dacia and all the work that was put in it. That's Trajan's column, and it still exists in Rome today. He also engaged in lots of public works for Rome, the city itself, and he provided for welfare payments for Roman citizens, or what you guys would call welfare payments. It tended to be grain supplies so that they had bread. Hadrian as well is known for his colossal work in Britain. So by the 2nd century AD, they were well into Britain, and Hadrian made sure that they had a wall between the British territory and the Picts in the north that inhabited the region of Scotland. And that wall was is called today Hadrian's Wall. It had a military installation every mile and ran for some 76 miles. So it was a massive capital investment, and probably the biggest of all of the Roman capital investments. Each military installation housed, when Rome was at its height, about 1,000 soldiers. Jerusalem then was also annexed under Hadrian, and Rome began to rule it as a province. Antonius Pius was known for as the humane emperor, meaning what? That he believed that, or he instituted not innocent until proven guilty as a law. He also said witnesses couldn't be tortured. Remember, those are things that came from natural law. The Romans believed in that there was a law in nature, and it was rational. So innocent until proven guilty, limits on torture. Marcus Aurelius gave us his Meditations. He was an emperor, but obviously found himself a writer and a philosopher, and he wrote Meditations, and they're basically pieces on Stoic philosophy. So Marcus Aurelius is always called the philosopher emperor. All right, that concludes any discussion of emperors in the early part of the Roman Empire here. Now we're going to turn to the big skills of the Romans, and that was in engineering and then in architecture. Now, I don't know if it's beautiful architecture, but it's massive architecture. And as we said earlier, they had two things that allowed them to build big, and that was cement, which meant they could build anywhere. Cement is composed of lime, water, and what we call debris, and that just means you could put rocks in there, you could put of any weight, right? Rocks and bricks and anything that was pretty heavy, you put into this lime and you mix it with water and it would get hardened, right? So you could make your cement essentially any weight you wanted. So if you used river rock, it was very heavy, and if you used things like pumice or lava rock, which are very light rocks, you could make your cement lighter. So that allowed for the buildings to go higher. They also invented the Roman arch, which allowed for buildings and walls to be built higher because they could carry more weight with the arch. And we'll look at that. This allowed Romans to build aqueducts. Aqueducts need arches when they cross rivers, etc., or big chasms on their way down. Aqua is a water duct. So the idea of an aqueduct is you have a water source, a lake maybe, up in the mountains, and you make that water descend all the way to the city, which means that you've got to raise the pathway of the water at times, and that's where we see the actual building for the aqueducts. So if your water is going to go over a chasm of some sort, you have to put a duct up there so you can keep it coming down at a steady pace. Anyways, that's what an aqueduct is. It's not a very glamorous thing. They built too the Colosseum. We'll have a look at that for a second. It's quite a large building. It could, it's large. The Pantheon then is something that we'll look at and I'll discuss in a little bit more depth. Pantheo, right? The building across all the gods, panning all the gods. Here's a picture of an aqueduct, and as I told you, the water flowed on top. So there's a duct on top that it flowed, but here you can see they were trying to get it from a high point to a low point in this river, and the canyon that it created was in the way. So they had to raise it up, and you can see the Roman arches here that allowed for getting the duct as high as possible because they could carry heavy weight. In fact, on these Roman arches, you can see that the arch comes down on the top of where the other arch is strongest here, right? So they wanted to put the arch weight that's at the bottom here on top of this other heavily built up part of the aqueduct, right? So you can see they put all of these on top where they could get the most support below them, right? This is the outside of the Colosseum. Two things about the Colosseum: it's built up high. It's built of cement too. You can see it tapers, in fact, and so it gets smaller and obviously lighter. It also has Greek design on it with the columns, and if you could see the bottom columns below this right here, you would see that they were Doric columns, so they're the simplest. Here you can see the Ionic scroll, and then above it you can see this is Corinthian. It is leafy, in fact, the ones up here. The second thing you'll notice about the columns is they're not necessary for support. They are just decorative columns, and they're even half columns. We actually call them pilasters. So they're using Greek architecture, but definitely not as part of the engineering. The engineering's all in the cement and in the arch. So let's look at a cross-section of the Colosseum. Here you can see that there's an internal, so there's arches going this way and the weight coming down, and then arches then of course going perpendicular to that as well. This is a cross-section of the Colosseum has come down. The whole thing would have come all the way around complete in its day. But you can see how much support they got by having these perpendicular arches here. And then they would have arches and they had the weight coming down. So basically the arch does this. It disperses weight. So if you took the top, the weight is pushed to the side down onto these big platforms. And the weight here is pushed to the side down on the big platforms. And so dispersing the weight allowed for them to build a building, whatever the sort of, up higher. All right, so that's the Colosseum. Lots of excavation in the Colosseum. Here you can see the wood walkway that you have is where the floor would have been of the Colosseum, and everything below that down here were the places where they kept the animals or the gladiators or whatever it was that was necessary for the show. So lots of excavation going on the floor, underneath the floor of the Colosseum. The only place where they have old seats left is over here. Otherwise you can only see the cement sort of platform that the seats were put on. And there's a lot about underneath the Colosseum, but we need to move on to the temple and the Pantheon. Before we look at the Pantheon, you need to understand what a classic Roman temple looked like and how it was different from a Greek. It looks visually like a Greek temple, except things that you probably noticed that are obvious differences. So here are the three things that are differences from a Greek temple. First off, the Roman temple has a podium down here. So they raised their temples onto platforms, and we call that a podium. The temple also had a cella that came all the way to the edge of the podium, so there wasn't a colonnade all the way around. There was just a porch. So a Roman temple has is sitting on a podium. It has a porch. Here you can see just how big the podium is by the people that are around it. It's quite high, right? And then the cella went all the way to the edges, so there's no colonnade around. Otherwise, it looks like a Greek temple, and especially the top, right, with a pediment and architrave and pediment and architrave. And this is called the Maison Carrée. It's built probably in about 269. It's in southern France. It's probably the best existing classical Roman temple. Now the Pantheon is like this, only it's a little bit different, and we can see some things about Roman architecture through the Pantheon. The front porch is just like the front porch of any other temple in Rome, but you want to know that these columns are monoliths. That means they're all one solid rock, so they had to bring those in and they had to pull them up with pulleys. The front part of this says this was made in the time of Marcus Agrippa, and you can see this M. Agrippa, right? So it was fabricated at the time of Marcus Agrippa. They think it was done, as this slide shows, in about 125 AD because they have found some bricks in their excavation that are marked in that period. So the Romans sometimes put the date on the bricking that they used in their architecture. We don't have the front part of the pediment and the relief anymore. But what you want to notice about the Pantheon is it's a round temple, right? So the temple is, behind it is circular, and in fact it's supposed to be exactly circular, so it's 141 feet wide, though in a cylinder, and it's 141 feet high. And then it's impressive later architects in particular, because it's still standing today. There's a picture not 2 years ago of the Roman Pantheon. Here is a construction of it, and then you can see it's like the Colosseum, right, in that it has arches, and this reconstruction here, this drawing of it, shows you the arches. Here you can see arches, and they come down on the heavy, and then they have internal arches as well, so you can walk between two walls basically, and the internal arches put weight down on the top of the arch here. So the internal arches go perpendicular right here, and then the weight comes down, and then they can disperse weight all the way down to big pylons that are represented by these half circles here. 1, 2, there's about 12. So they pushed the weight off so they could get it higher, and then they came down on top of these half circle pylons that are all the way around this cross-section picture. Sorry, let me go back and say one more thing about this, the reconstruction here. You can see the dome. That's the thing that fascinates everyone, and that's the big quandary in architecture for thousands of years after or 8,000 years after the Romans. Everybody's trying to put domes up. And this is the largest one until we get the Florentine dome. So this is what they did. They built it up cylinder, and then they put supports around the outside, because what the problem is that if you have a dome or a circular structure, the problem is buckling out. So the circular restraints here are supposed to, and they did apparently, prevent it from buckling out. And then the other thing that's unique about the Roman Pantheon is the hole at the top, which is called the oculus, and we'll have a picture of that in just a second. The second thing they did, though, besides these band supports here, is they made the cement much lighter. So we'll look inside, but they started with heavy brick cement, and they ended with lighter lava cement here, and then they even put divots into the cement so that they could cut some of the cement out to make it lighter on the top. So let's have a look at that, right? The Roman interior of the Pantheon looks like this. So the building goes up, they put the heavy cement on the bottom, and then as they went up, they lightened the cement, and then when you get to the the dome, they dug it out. They call these coffers. So they put lighter cement, and then they dug that cement out to make it even lighter. And then the ceiling looks like this. So it's all coffered all the way up. And then they left a hole at the top. The biggest crisis for a dome is that it will collapse at the middle. So the oculus here is a big, conundrum for historians, in the sense that they don't know exactly why they left the oculus. Did they leave it open because Rome was a city to the world, and this was the temple for all their gods, the pantheon, and so that it was open to the world? Did they leave it open because they could use it, given natural light, as a calendar? It could tell the times of the year. Those are two guesses. I usually go with the third guess, which is praxis. They were very practical people, and nobody had an answer for preventing collapse if they covered it completely. So instead they reinforced it and left it open. So the rain still comes in today when it's raining outside. But that's the oculus. You're free to decide what you want, but I think they were very practical, and that it's lasted all the way to today. So their praxis was the thing for all time. All right. Now let's turn to the decline of the empire, and what in the 3rd century are seen as signs of crisis. A lot of these are economic, right? I don't put here, but there's a lot of depopulation. So populations are declining. There's a lack of capital investment, and that means the rebuilding of roads, city buildings, aqueducts, sewers, everything, right? They ceased to put as much money into those things, and so the cities began to look shabbier. All the while, the wealthy classes were living greater lives of luxury and leisure. They tended to exploit a peasantry, people that were actually going out to the countryside. They were known as coloni. And because the cities were in decline, these coloni were going to the countryside, large estates, and they were pledging themselves and any of their children and their children's children, right, any progeny, to the owner of this estate. So they said, we will give our lives to this and any children that we have, if you will take care of us and allow us to work. And the term for that in Latin is coloni. So that's interesting because that's a pre-serf term, right? So we're going to get to the serfs, but people were doing this on their own. Reason had lost its hold. People couldn't trust what came the next day, right? That everything was going to pan out as they expected. It's really noticeable in terms of law, right? The city was full of, or the government was full of corruption at all levels, whether it was the tax collector or senators. And without a rational system to depend on, people did what they always do, which is turn to mysticism and spiritualism. Decadence and debauchery too, but mysticism and spiritualism, right? All right, so religion, and we know that the Christian religion grows up in this time. It grows up actually during the Pax Romana, which might be a reason why Jesus, if he existed, right, was a passive and very nonviolent individual, because the Roman world was relatively at peace at that time. But let's look first. Remember, the Romans themselves are polytheists, so they reject Christian cults as they were at first, or Christian enclaves and Jewish enclaves, right? So they're hostile to it. They have periods of persecution. They martyr the Christians as well, right? But you should know they have the same 12 gods as the Greeks did. In fact, they renamed them. Jupiter is the Greek Zeus. Mars is the Greek Ares. Venus is the Greek Aphrodite. gosh, those are the ones I could think of offhand. They also believed in uniquely Roman things, and ancestor worship was part of that. Each house had its own worship of ancestors and those who came before. They had a house lar that comes out of Etruscan civilization prior to the Roman Republican period. They also believed that the emperor was a high priest, and so they gave him the term Pontifex Maximus. That meant the high priest. So in the West, he had an important position in religious ceremonies in that capacity. When he went to the Eastern Mediterranean, they often associated him as a god with this Pontifex Maximus. They also had mystery cults, and these mystery cults, many of them came from the East. The most well-known come from the East. The cult of Mithras and that of Isis. Right? And Rome, the city itself, had a cult of Isis in it. Right? And those would be cults that would be in other Roman cities as well. Right? The mystery cults. Right? They had mysterious and private ceremonies. Right? Finally, there is a religion / philosophy, and that is Neoplatonism. And as I explained to you guys when we talked about Plato himself, he had an idea that ultimately all education was headed for what he called the good. And the Neoplatonists associate the good with God as well, right? So the good is God, and so we got many Neoplatonists. The most well-known who discusses Neoplatonism, although he's a Christian, is Boethius. New loyalty, Christianity. Christianity has, as the centuries gone by from the beginning of Pax Romana, been a cult, or not a cult, it's been a small enclaves of Christians, but it has definitely spread into the West. It's, of course, a sect from the East. Jesus was seen as a subversive among the Jews. So they're the ones who, as we said, turned him over to Pontius Pilate, and they tried him for treason, which is why he was executed and crucified. And it's very consistent with Roman law, and we do have a Pontius Pilate in the East in this period. So the tales of the Bible have many artifacts that help to substantiate it, right? In the first centuries, all the way through the 3rd century, Christians were often persecuted, not always, but persecuted and or martyred. In the 4th century, we get conversion of many Romans, and especially the elites, until finally we get a conversion of the emperor himself, and that will be Constantine will convert to Christianity on his deathbed. Eventually, as the centuries pass after the 5th century, the Catholic and the Orthodox Christians will divide, and they're finally divided irrevocably in the 11th century AD. So that division takes some time. Catholic means universal Christian, and Orthodox means right-thinking Christian. Catholic religion tended to evolve with new ceremonies and new beliefs, and the Orthodox religions, right, the Orthodox Greeks, the Orthodox Armenians, the Orthodox Serbians, the Orthodox Russians, right, they tended to have to change through councils, and it wasn't quite as free, so they remained closer to the early church traditions, even today. All right, so that's the break. That takes many, many years. And now let's look. So we've got Christianity causing a crisis in the Roman Empire because it turned the allegiance of people away from the state of Rome itself. Right? And that's usually what we say is the problem with Christianity. The empire was also overextended, and I think we talked about that earlier with the maps. But you want to see two emperors that tried to deal with the whole problem of the overextension of the empire. I think Diocletian was probably the smarter of the two, but here it is, right? Diocletian was the emperor from 284 to 305, and he wanted to solve the problem of a massive empire that was almost impossible for one man to rule over. He also had a problem of military anarchy, and that means that there were revolts out on the frontier by his own military. That was one of the manifestations of that anarchy. He thought that the best way to rule the entire empire was to divide it in half and create what he called a tetrarchy, that you would have an emperor and a Caesar on each side of the empire. And the emperor would be, of course, the ruler, and the Caesar would be his right-hand man who was heir apparent to the emperor. And that was his idea, and he implements it for a very short term, of how to manage the increasing lawlessness in the empire. So two sides of the empire, each side having an emperor and a Caesar. Constantine takes over after Diocletian, and Constantine wants to reunite the empire. And he is willing to allow Christians toleration. So he passes the Edict of Non that required toleration of the Christian religion, so no longer would they be persecuted with that. Constantine himself will convert to Christianity in 337, right on his deathbed. And that was very common amongst Romans, to convert to Christianity on their deathbed. They thought, right, if you converted, then you're baptized and you're cleaned of all sin. So on your deathbed, then you have no sin and you would go to heaven, was the assumption. He reunited the empire in 324 and then tried to run it again as a single empire, but with a capital city that was better placed. And that's when he built Constantinople. If you look at the map, Constantinople is at the mouth of the Black Sea, right where the Asian part of the empire can cross over into the European part of the empire. It's a great strategic location for a city. So if Rome was to function as one single empire and continue to, Constantinople was the place to have your central or capital city, and not in Rome. And so he moves it there, and he's about the only one that occupies the city in Constantinople. It was a good idea, it just didn't pan out. Rome had for so long been the traditional center of the empire, even if it wasn't geographically the center of the empire. Right? But Constantinople would remain, and it would flourish because it was at a crossroads, so it was perfect location commercially and economically. So then we'll see it becomes the center of the Byzantine Empire. But Constantine created it, and he created it as the idea behind reuniting the empire. All right, we're getting towards the end. We come to the barbarian invasions. So we see that Rome is in economic decline. The state is not replacing and rebuilding. We've got Christianity that's diverting the allegiance of Romans and Roman citizens from Rome itself to a Christian God. We have two emperors that show us, right, that the empire is becoming unmanageable for an emperor, that there was anarchy, military anarchy out on the borders. And then finally we have the barbarian invasions, and barbarian invasions are mostly Germanic, right? The Huns are the only ones that are not Germanic, but otherwise it's largely Germanic, both the Franks and the Saxons. The Saxons go into what is today Britain, the Franks come into what is today France. As we said, the Visigoths, which means Eastern Germans, came across and occupied Spain. One Visigoth invaded, so you can see that some of this is not just migration, but really military invasion. Alaric, and in 410 he would loot Rome itself, so he brought his army in, they looted Rome. Right? The Ostrogoths would take residence up in the on the Italian peninsula and in the on the Balkan peninsula, right? And remember, they're coming from across the Danube, right? The Huns came in from Central Asia, right? They came in and invasion, right? They didn't, not so much a migration. And they looted Rome. They invaded the northern part of Italy. They will sack Rome at one point as well. Attila the Hun eventually goes up towards Paris and dies right outside of Paris. The Vandals then will invade the North African coast, so they go all the way around and invade the North African coast. And they also sack Rome in 455 AD. So you can see kind of the crisis in the 5th century of looters, invaders, Rome's finally sacked, and the German people are coming in and taking up residence. That tells you that Rome had something to offer. Its civilization had built up cities, and even if they were in decline, it was much better than the tribal existence that they had north of the Danube in the German region. And here it is, right, as the invasion, the barbarian invasions as they have it, were finished. You can see the Ostrogoths on the Italian peninsula right here. And the Visigoths have occupied more or less what is Spain. The Vandals are down here in North Africa. The Franks and other German tribes, the Burgundians, right? Anglo-Saxons will invade in the British area. And this map also shows you it's all becoming divided up. This yellow part will be the Byzantine Empire. We're still in the 6th century here. It says 500 AD, or at the beginning of the 6th century. It's not until 632 or the 600s, 632 is when Muhammad dies, that we get the Islamic empires over here. So you got about 100 years where the Byzantine Empire was extended very far. And then when the Islamic armies come in, they're going to defeat the Byzantines, and they'll cut the Byzantine Empire all the way down to just this Turkish area and then across onto what we call the Balkan Peninsula. So the Byzantine Empire shrinks very quickly with the advent of Islam. All right, so the fall of the empire is usually dated, though, to a barbarian king becoming emperor. That's in 476 AD, and his name is Odoacer, and he is an Ostrogoth. The empire has declined in population extremely, so it's lots of depopulation has gone on. Economic decline, especially seen in infrastructure, but the decrease in trade in the Roman Empire. The people are being taxed. Tax collection is done by people who are corrupt, number one, and the government has told the tax collectors that if they don't collect the taxes, then the tax collector himself would have to pay what they estimate the region owed, right? So the tax collector had every incentive to get as much as he could out of the population. The military was overextended, and then it started to turn on itself, and then finally into this void, right? When the Romans had left their frontiers open and not well defended, came migrating and invading tribesmen, right? And so the barbarian invasions, most of which again were German, with the exception of the Huns, right? And that's the end of the Roman Empire, and we're at 476 AD, and the beginning of the medieval period will start right after this. Oh yes, and finally Christianity, right? Again, Christianity turning the allegiance of Romans away from their citizenship to their spiritual and eternal souls, right? So that's Christianity just left Rome without its loyalty, or at least that's the usual historical assessment. All right, so Rome has fallen, and we will get a fragmented West, a Byzantine Empire, and eventually the Islamic states. thank you very much. And sorry, it's the first time. I know I wasn't quite as fluid as I'd like to be.